Welcome everyone to another edition of Play It Through, and on this edition it's Karate Champ, brought to us by Data East. Originally released as a two-player versus arcade cabinet, was later ported by Data East themselves over to the NES here in North America. The arcade version of the game featured a very unique two-joystick per player battle system that allowed you to pull off a ton of different karate moves. And when ported over to the NES in this version that we'll be playing, this was hard to emulate, using only one controller per player. Because of this, the game does suffer in the control department, with many people considering it a pretty poor game overall due to this fact. The art I'm showing here is actually a poster for the arcade version of the game, but I did like the anime art style, so I wanted to include that. Here we go with Karate Champ for the NES. When you play the game, you can pick it up as one or two player, of course the two player being a strictly versus mode, and actually is probably one of the most enjoyable things about the game. The single player mode, of course, has you battling a computer opponent. Your goal, of course, is to try to get the highest score possible by going round after round against the computer opponents in all different settings. Basically, you have a best 2 out of 3 rounds against your opponent. Whenever you make contact with your opponent or your opponent hits you, you end up scoring a point. After you've scored a total of 3 points, you win the round. Whoever wins 2 rounds first is the winner. Per round, there's also a 30-second time limit. Whoever has more points at the end of the time limit wins the round that way. There is a large list of moves in order to pull off. Every direction you basically press on the D-pad and then press one of the attack buttons, either A or B, will perform a different attack. Learning what attack is going to which button and which directions, of course, is going to be essential here. My favorite is really just the standard punch. The 3 moves I use the absolute most are the standard standing punch, the sweep kick, either holding down and A or down and B to do a backwards kick, or you actually can press B just standing up in order to do a backwards roundhouse style kick. These are the moves I will be using for the most part in order to complete the game, though there are plenty of other moves to do. Learning the other moves will help you out in this instance, the post-match minigame. Here is a complete bonus round. It doesn't matter how many points you get. As soon as you end up taking a hit from one of the vases, you move on to the next round. Your goal is to break as many vases and collect as many points as you can, and then you go on to the next matchup. The early opponents, of course, are a lot easier to deal with than the later opponents, trying to give you at least an easy way in, trying to learn these controls. One thing I learned pretty easily is that a lot of opponents will walk straight into a punch. If you time this correctly, sometimes you'll be able to keep hitting your opponent over and over again, winning both rounds of an entire matchup with just one move. Just pressing that button over and over in order to hit the opponent. My goal usually is to lure the opponent in, try that punch. If the punch is blocked, then start going into your other moveset. A few things that you can easily do in the game, and I'll be doing throughout, is if the punch ends up missing, I go for the sweep kick. Usually at that point, either punching or doing the sweep kick, sometimes the opponent will do a jump kick towards you. As long as you're not directly at the end of the leg of your opponent when he does the jump kick, he'll go over your head. Because there's such a long delay once the opponent jumps over your head, you'll have a good enough time to actually stand on your feet and do a backwards roundhouse kick in order to hit your opponent in the back, giving you a free opportunity to hit. If you've never played the game before, this is probably a lot to take in. The controls take the absolute most getting used to in this game. Especially playing with a friend, if neither one of you have ever played the game before, you'll have a lot of fun just trying to figure out what's going on. Because unfortunately you can't turn around in the game, it uses the other buttons as your backward attacks. So even though my opponent may eventually get behind me, which he'll do several times throughout the matchups, I can actually not face him. I have to keep pressing the normal attack buttons behind me in order to keep trying to leg sweep him from behind or roundhouse kick him. You keep ranking up every matchup you end up winning, as you can see with the total ranking counter up in the upper left corner, currently going for the 3rd one here. You have the timer, of course, in the middle for that individual round, and then the score over to the right, which the default high score is 50,000 points, and of course your score is then below it. Underneath the current third is the point system itself, with the different diamonds lighting up depending upon the hits I end up getting, and then below that is the number of rounds per the matchup that I've currently won. Connecting with all the different moves in the game give you different amounts of points. The standard punch giving you pretty much the fewest amount of points. Even though it ends up being one of the most effective strategies to use in the game, you're not going to be ranking up a high score necessarily with this. You want to mix up your attacks in order to actually get a higher score, but since this game is rather difficult and my real goal here is just to complete a set of matches, I'm going to use whatever method I can in order to actually beat each of the opponents. Here we get into a nice dueling matchup with the opponent behind me as I'm trying to do the backwards kick in order to hit him. The goal isn't really just to keep spamming the same attacks and hoping to land. You're really supposed to be looking out for opportunities in your opponent's offense in order to hit him with a counter move. The hit detection in the game can be very weird, and because of that, sometimes it's best just to keep spamming a move because you may eventually land it even though he's not changing his position at all. The worst part for the hit detection definitely comes in the bonus game itself when all the vases are flying at you. You have to be very, very precise and use the exact correct move in order to hit each vase as it's flying towards you. Messing up any of those hits by even just a fraction of a second, you'll end up taking a vase to the face and end up moving on to the next round. And here ends up being one of my overall better matches against the computer in this game, as I actually reach the time limit and end up winning the round that way. During the vase minigame, the low kicks are the hardest ones to actually make contact with, and these are the ones you'll probably find yourself getting hit the most by the flying flowers. Being released in arcades in 1984, and then this version coming out in 1986, Karate Champ is one of the earliest examples of a fighting game. Especially one of the very few ones that even came to the NES, as only a handful of fighters made it to the system. At least for me, this is one of those games that when I first started playing it, I hated the controls and had really no idea what I was doing. And then once I've learned the controls and able to go with the computer back and forth, match after match, I end up finding myself really enjoying the game when it gets down to it. I also find that the game actually is pretty satisfying when you're able to do a counter to your opponent, especially when the opponent does that jump over me with the flying kick, and I'm able to hit him in the back just as he's going over me with the backwards roundhouse kick. Just that little animation alone gave the feeling that you really are trying to counter your opponent. And then of course my opponent follows that up by just walking into my fist a few times, negating the intelligence the opponent seemingly had just a few seconds earlier. You end up going up 8 different ranks, and then once you've gone past the 8th rank, you then are the champion. However, the game doesn't end there, the game keeps going, but it doesn't even reach its loop at that point. You still actually have a few matches as champion before you end up going back to the very first stage of the game. I don't know if the opponents really get too much harder after that, as usually I only play through that very first cycle. Also, when we get to the end, you'll see that once we complete it, there's no ending to the game. It just does keep on going without even really any acknowledgement of when you become champion, which would have been at least nice. Here's a perfect example to end this round and end the matchup with one of those backwards roundhouse kicks as my opponent jumped over me. Like I said, it's actually pretty satisfying to do. And it's actually one of the best counters and ways that I found in order to actually get a free shot on the opponent. Of course, sometimes you'll end up completely missing him, or he'll still end up being able to get out of it, but it's probably one of the better opportunities at a free hit if your opponent, of course, decides to do that flying kick. As for the flying kick itself, which you have to actually press up and the attack button at the same exact time, is probably one of the worst moves I was able to do in the game. I seemingly missed every single time I would do it in practice, and I don't think I ever actually made contact with the opponent. Though I'm sure there could be some out there that do that, and only that, and hit the opponent over and over again like I do with the normal standard punch. See, after we've completed 7 full rounds and ranked up, we are now at the 8th matchup, which we are now the champion against the opponent. At this point, our actual overall level in the upper left corner won't change. It'll say CMP from here on out, but we keep going a few more matches. Actually, we have this match and 2 more before we end up going back to the first level of the game on the cliffs. The opponent at this point is extremely difficult overall, though sometimes you may still be able to get him in one of those loops of hitting the punch over and over. This is probably my overall favorite of the settings. This island setting in between the 2 trees seems like the perfect showdown for the actual championship, even though we actually won it on the previous level. As you can see though, over the last few matches, I was able to go over 50,000 points, now having the high score. Of course, like many classic NES arcade games that keep score, there's no way to save your score, so once you've turned off the game, the score resets back to the default 50,000. And as you can see, a nice flying kick from the opponent leaves him wide open as I'm able to finish this round and move on to the last matchup here in the first cycle of Karate Champ. The final matchup actually takes place in a weird kind of factory zone. This area is just full of steel and boxes in the background. It's like, why exactly are we battling in basically what could probably be a shipping containment ship? Or some kind of factory. But either way, it's the perfect place to have a championship karate matchup. One last thing, of course, I have to give props to the digitized voice acting that they did use in the game. It was something they also had done in the arcade version, and even though not fantastic, at least they did give it a shot here. Just those few words that the game is able to utter gives it a real different kind of feel. That's something we haven't really seen too much in early NES titles, and definitely makes the game stand out. Here I'm able to deliver the final hit to the opponent, and I've now completed the entire first cycle of levels here in Karate Champion. Of course, just like always though, we end up getting another sequence with the vases, and then it actually goes back to the very first level on the cliffs, and we can start the game all over again. But with that, that's going to wrap up this edition of Play It Through. I'd like to thank you for watching, and of course, I hope you enjoyed.